They told her the tribute cart was an honor. That was the word they used. The headman of Dunvale standing in the frost-crusted yard with his hands clasped behind his back and his eyes fixed somewhere above her left ear. An honor. As if the word could change the cold iron ring bolted to the cart's floor, the ring her ankle would be chained to for the 4-day journey north to the Lycan king's keep. As if language was the thing that mattered when your village had failed its tithe of 40 cattle and had nothing left to offer the Iron Pact but a girl. She was 19 years old. She had her mother's healer hands and her father's stubbornness, and a crescent-shaped birthmark below her left collarbone that she had hidden since childhood under high collars and rough wool. She did not know, that morning in the frost, that the mark would save her life. She did not know that the most feared king on the continent would see it and feel, for one split second, as though a bell had been struck inside his chest. She did not know that before the next moon rose, he would kneel. The year was 847 of the Iron Pact, and the night of Ash Moon was 3 days away. If you have ever wondered what a story like this one costs to tell, stay with it. Leave a like when you know how it ends. The tribute cart left Dunvale before the sun cleared the ridge. There were 4 others in it besides Syrah, 2 young men with debt marks on their wrists, an older woman who kept her eyes shut for all 4 days, and a boy of perhaps 16 who wept quietly into his knees until the cold dried his face and silence took him. The cart's driver was a warden's man in a gray cloak, and he did not speak at all. The roads north turned from frozen mud to black stone after the 2nd day, and the keep began to show itself on the horizon like a bruise that would not heal. Gray and massive against a sky the color of ash. Mirette was waiting at the keep's south gate. She was not waiting for Sarah specifically. She was waiting for tribute arrivals the way she had waited for 30 years of them, with a wooden tablet, a charcoal stick, and the unhurried certainty of someone who has long since stopped expecting the world to surprise her. She was short and wrapped in a wool mantle the color of river mud, and she moved through the 5 new arrivals with practiced efficiency, noting names, debts of origin, and assigned stations without ceremony. She assigned the older woman to the laundry, the 2 young men to the grain stores, the boy to the stables. She assigned Sarah to the cold hall. The cold hall was not as bad as the name suggested, Marit told her, leading her through corridors of dressed stone and firelight. It was called that because it sat at the keep's north face, where the wind came through the high casements in winter regardless of what you stuffed into them. But the hearth was good, and the work was clear. Sarah would assist with preparations for the Ash Moon conclave. She would carry, fetch, set tables, and stay out of the way of anyone who looked as though they had a reason to speak to the king. Anyone in particular? Sarah asked. Marit looked at her sidelong. Everyone in particular, she said. It was good advice. Sarah would not follow it. The Ash Moon conclave filled the keep's great hall with the worst people on the continent. That was not an assessment. It was a practical description of what tribute season delivered. High wardens from 6 tributary territories arrived in furred cloaks and gold-chased armor, each trailing advisors and guards and, in 2 cases, other people's daughters dressed as gifts. Sarah watched them from the edges of the room, carrying platters and filling cups, and tried to understand the room's architecture. Who bowed to whom, who stood close to whom, who watched the king's chair even when the king was not in it. The king was not in it for a long time. When Bastian entered, the room did not announce him. There was no herald, no trumpet, no ceremonial entrance through the tall doors. He simply arrived from a side passage, and the air in the room changed the way the air changes before a storm front crosses a ridge, not louder but heavier, pressing down. He was tall in the specific way that men accustomed to violence are tall, as if the body has organized itself around a function rather than a form. His hair was dark and cut close on the sides. His hands, when he settled them on the arms of the throne, showed old scars along the knuckles. He wore no crown. He did not need one. Sarah was 12 feet away, pouring wine into a cup no one had asked for. She should have kept her eyes on the cup. She knew, even as she did it, that she should have kept her eyes on the cup. Instead, she looked up, the way you look at lightning even knowing it will hurt, and found that he was already looking back. His eyes were pale gray, the color of ice over deep water. The recognition hit him first. She could not have named it as such. To her it registered as the weight of authority, the king's gaze landing on a tribute girl the way a stone lands on water, meaning only pressure. She held his gaze for 2 seconds longer than was wise because her father's stubbornness lived in her spine as well as her name, and then she looked away. Bastian did not. He said something to the man at his left shoulder, a slight, precise man with dark eyes and a counselor's careful posture, and the man nodded and withdrew. The conclave continued around him. The high wardens made their presentations, their arguments, their pledges. Sarah moved through the room doing her work and watching from behind the neutral face she had learned in the 4 days on the tribute cart, and she did not look at the king again until the room had thinned and she had no choice. Ford found her first. He was the High Warden of the Greyvale territory, a man of perhaps 50 with a merchant's stillness and a merchant's habit of assessing the value of everything he looked at. He had a clerk's face, precise and economical, and he wore his authority the way some men wear expensive rings, as advertisement rather than ornament. He stopped in front of her with the same unhurried certainty Moret had shown at the gate, and the similarity ended there. "Dunvale," he said. It was not a question. He had read the tablet. "Yes, my lord." "The cattle debt." "Yes, my lord." He looked at her for a moment longer than assessment warranted. Something moved behind his eyes that she could not read, and then he turned and walked away. She was still watching him go when she felt the other presence, the one that pressed the air down and made the room quiet at its edges. Bastian was 2 feet away. She had not heard him cross the floor. She did not know how a man that size moved without sound, but he did. And now he stood close enough that she could smell the cold on his cloak and something underneath it, something that her body registered before her mind could form a word for it. Like iron and pine resin and the specific warmth of a living thing that outweighed everything around it. Her hands tightened on the empty platter. She kept her eyes level, which meant they landed somewhere around the second button of his tunic, and she held that position and waited. "Look up," he said. His voice was what she had expected from his size, and not what she had expected from his face. Low and careful, as if words cost him something he had learned to spend precisely. She looked up. She had squared herself to stare him down. That was the stubbornness, doing what it always did, taking the worst possible option and committing to it. But what happened when her eyes met his was not the confrontation she had braced for. His expression did not change. His eyes did not flash gold or silver or any of the colors that pack lore associated with the bond. He simply looked at her, and then his gaze dropped, very deliberately, to the high collar of her wool dress, and she felt the blood leave her face. He knew. She could not have said how. She had kept the mark covered since she was 7 years old, since the day her mother pressed her hands flat against the crescent and said, quietly, "Never let them see this." She had worn high collars through summer and winter both, had deflected every healer's examination with the particular social machinery of a girl who has learned to be invisible. He could not have seen it. He reached out and, with one finger, moved the collar aside. The crescent birthmark showed below her left collarbone, dark against her skin, the shape exact and unmistakable. The sound Bastian made was not a word. It was barely audible, a drawn breath that he caught before it could become something larger. A sound like a man who has been looking for something for a very long time and has just found it in the last place he thought to look. His jaw tightened. His finger withdrew. The collar fell back into place. Sarah took a step back, because the stubbornness had finally recognized something it could not win against, and was advising retreat. "Stay in the keep," Bastian said. "Do not go near the south gate." He walked away. She stood there for a long moment, trying to decide whether she had been threatened or protected, and could not sort it out. The platter was cold in her hands. Across the room, Vord was watching her with his merchant's eyes. She had been seen by 2 men that night. The problem was that only one of them frightened her, and it was not the king. If you are wondering where this is going, I promise you the answer is worth the wait. Stay close. Marit came to her room before the keep went quiet. The room was a small stone cell off the cold hall, furnished with a pallet, a chest, and a candle in an iron holder. Marit sat on the chest without ceremony and looked at Sarah with the expression of someone who has been carrying a fact for a long time and has finally found someone obliged to receive it. "The crescent mark," Marit said. Sarah said nothing. "I trained in pact lore for 12 years before I came to this keep," Marit said. "I read the founding registry. All of it. The original scrolls, not the copies they make now. There is a section in the Iron Pact's founding charter, written in the 3rd year of the pact, that describes a promised bride bloodline. A lineage that would hold the bond mark, a crescent below the left collarbone. The line was registered as extinct 22 years ago." She paused. "The registration was a lie." Sarah pulled her collar tighter. "You're telling me I'm supposed to be his bride. I'm telling you what the mark means according to the founding charter. What you do with that is your own concern." "What I do with it," Sarah said, "is nothing. I am a tribute girl. I came here in a chain. If I walk up to the Lycan king and say I carry the promised bride mark, I am more likely to be executed for false claiming than crowned for correct claiming." Marit looked at her for a moment. "He already saw it." "Then he can do something about it," Sarah said. "I won't." Marit stood up, smoothed her wool mantle and moved to the door. She paused there. "Your mother," she said. "She was trained as a healer. So was her mother before her. Did she ever mention wolfsbane protocols?" Sarah looked at her sharply. "Why?" "Because the king was poisoned 2 months ago. Not enough to kill him. Enough to keep him unstable. Someone has been adding wolfsbane to his food in doses small enough that the keep healers attribute the symptoms to fatigue and season sickness." Maret's voice did not change. The same flat delivery she had used for everything else. "If it progresses, it will kill him. If someone competent enough treated it, it would not." She left. Sarah sat for a long time in the candlelight, her hand pressed flat against the crescent mark through her wool dress, her mother's voice somewhere in the back of her memory reciting wolfsbane protocols with the calm precision of someone who understood that precision was the difference between a person living and dying. She did not want to be anyone's promised bride. She did not want to be the instrument of a charter written 300 years before she was born. The answer to a prophecy she had not consented to. The woman some ancient power had designated without her knowledge or agreement. She wanted to go home to Dunvale, where the fields were cold and the work was hard, and nobody looked at her birthmark like it was a claim on her future. She could not go home to Dunvale. Vord had seen to that. The reclassification notice came the next morning, slipped under her door on a strip of official parchment. It accused her of attempting unauthorized departure from the keep's South Ward, which was a lie, and reclassified her status from tribute worker to runaway detainee, which was a reclassification only Vord had the authority to issue for a Greyvale origin tribute. The notice cited a sentence of 7 days in the keep cell's pending review. It was signed with Vord's precise economical hand. The guard came for her at mid-morning. He was not unkind, which was its own kind of information. He moved her through the keep corridors with a professional distance that suggested he did not entirely believe the charge, but was not being paid to hold opinions. He locked her into a cell in the keep's lower level, a stone room with a drain in the floor and a single torch in the corridor outside, and told her review would be in 7 days. The cell was cold. The drain smelled of old water and iron. She sat with her back against the far wall and worked through what she had and had not. She did not have her freedom. She did not have the king's formal acknowledgement. She did not have the founding registry in her hands or any ally with the authority to contest Vord's reclassification. She had Moret's knowledge, which was locked in an old woman's memory and was worth nothing while Sarah was in a cell. She had her mother's healer training. She had the mark. On the second day, Moret appeared at the cell door. She did not explain how she had gotten past the cell corridor's guard. She simply appeared with a small wrapped bundle of dried herbs and a ceramic pot no larger than a fist, and she pushed both through the door's iron gap with a practitioner's care. "The king is worse," Moret said. "3 of the keep healers went to him this morning. He sent them away. He will send anyone away who comes with a diagnosis they cannot support with anything but guesswork." She looked at Sarah steadily. "He will not send you away." He saw the mark. "I'm locked in a cell." "The cell can be unlocked," Moret said. "That is the simpler problem. The harder problem is that Vord has already sent a message to Caldric." Sarah looked at her. "Who is Caldric?" "The king's chief counselor, the slight man with the dark eyes who stood at his left shoulder during the conclave." Moret's voice remained flat. "He is also the man who filed the registry amendment 22 years ago that declared the promised bride bloodline extinct. He is the reason your mother hid your mark. He is the reason your grandmother's name does not appear in the official pact records the way it once did." The cold in the cell was very particular. It had a weight to it. "He knows about the mark," Moret continued. "Vord told him. Together they are moving to formalize a severance rite, a ceremony that will dissolve any proto-bond the king's recognition may have initiated. It requires witnesses and a registered officiant, and it requires the king to be too ill to attend his own severance proceedings." She looked at the ceramic pot. "Which he will be, if no one treats him." Sarah picked up the ceramic pot. She turned it in her hands. "You cannot get me out of this cell," she said. It was not a question. "Not officially," Moret agreed. "The guard on third watch is a young man from the eastern tributary who owes me a considerable favor. He is not a complicated person. He will look the other way for 2 hours between the second and third bell." Sarah closed her eyes. She thought about her mother's hands sorting dried herbs on a wooden table in Dunvale, the specific competence of those hands, the way her mother had never once explained the Wolfsbane protocols as anything other than practical knowledge, never connected them to kings or marks or ancient charters. She had taught Sarah because it was useful, because someone knowing it was better than no one knowing it. 3 nights, Sarah said, remembering what Moret had told her. If the poisoning has progressed to the 3rd stage, it takes 3 nights of treatment to pull someone through. Moret said nothing, which was its own kind of confirmation. "Show me where his chambers are," Sarah said. The king's chambers were on the keep's upper level, past 2 sets of guards who stepped aside without a word when Moret moved through them, the old keep woman's authority apparently operating on a register that had nothing to do with official rank. The chamber door was heavy oak banded in iron. Moret stopped outside it. She did not knock. "In there," she said, and left. Sarah stood at the door with the ceramic pot in one hand and the wrapped herbs under her arm. She knocked. No answer. She knocked again, and then she opened the door herself, because the stubbornness was back, and because the alternative was a man dying of a poison, while the people who had planted it assembled a ceremony to strip him of his only remedy. Bastian was on the floor. Not collapsed, not unconscious. He had apparently made it from the bed to the window and lost the argument with the distance on the way back, and was now sitting against the side of the bed with his knees drawn up and his forearms on his knees, his head dropped. His breathing was audible from the door. His skin had the gray-green cast that wolfsbane poisoning made at the third stage, the stage her mother had described in exact clinical terms. Fever cycling with sudden cold drops, the muscles locking unpredictably, the chest tightening as the poison accumulated in the blood. She crossed the room and crouched in front of him. His head lifted. His pale gray eyes found her face and stayed there, and something moved in them that she could not name, a recognition that was not surprise, as if some part of him had expected her to come through a door eventually and was simply noting that the door had been this one. "You should be in the cells," he said. His voice was lower than it had been in the hall, roughened by the fever. "You should be in bed," she said. "We both made poor choices. Let me help you." He looked at the ceramic pot. He looked at her hands. His jaw worked for a moment. Then, because he was apparently as unwilling to lose an argument as she was, he said nothing more and let her work. The first night was the worst. She ground the herbs and steeped them in water she heated over his hearth fire, working through her mother's protocol from memory. 4 measures of dried white leaf to 1 of the counter compound. Steep for precisely as long as it took to recite the names of the 7 packed territories. Strain through a cloth she appropriated from his washstand without asking. Administer in 2 doses 2 hours apart. He kept the first dose down. He did not keep the second. She made a third and held the cup herself while he drank, and she watched his throat move, and she thought about Vord's precise economical signature on the reclassification notice, and felt something cold and focused settle inside her. Bastian slept toward the 3rd bell, fitfully, with his breathing still rough and his hands locked into fists at his sides. She sat by the hearth and watched the fire and waited, the way her mother had taught her, because the hardest part of tending was not the medicine but the watching, the willingness to stay with someone through the worst hours without requiring that the worst hours be over. He woke before dawn and looked at her across the room. "The mark," he said. "Yes," she said. "You know what it is?" "Marit told me." A long silence. The fire had dropped to coals and the room was the color of old bronze. "I have not moved to claim it," he said. "You should know that. I will not use the mark to bind you to something you did not choose." She looked at him for a moment. In the low bronze light, with the fever gray fading slowly from his face and the scars on his hands visible against the blanket, he looked less like a king and more like a man who had been carrying a weight alone for a long time and had begun to show the specific exhaustion of it. "Caldric filed the amendment that declared my bloodline extinct," she said, 22 years ago. Something moved in his expression, not surprise, something harder. "That is not possible," he said, and then, hearing himself say it, he went quiet, because it was the response of a man who trusted his chief counselor's records without checking the originals, and he was not, apparently, a man who could stay comfortable in that realization for long. She came back the second night. No one stopped her. The cell corridor's guard was a young man from the eastern tributary who had an excellent relationship with selective vision, and the keep corridors at the 3rd bell were empty. She came with the herbs and the ceramic pot, and the specific quiet of a person who has decided to do a thing and is no longer arguing with herself about it. The second night was calmer. The fever cycled lower. She worked through the protocol again, and he submitted to it without argument, which told her more than anything he had said, because a man who held his authority like a second skin and carried his power without needing to demonstrate it had to be genuinely willing to let someone help him. He asked her questions while she worked, short, precise questions about Dunvale, about her mother, about the healer's training, and how she had kept the mark hidden and for how long. She answered in the same register, without performance, and felt the room change around them the way a room changes when 2 people stop deciding whether to trust each other and simply do. He told her, in 2 sentences, that he had been alone since his first mate had died 3 years ago. He did not make it a grief speech or a confession. He said it the way he said everything, as a fact being placed on a table for examination, and then he was quiet. She said, "I am sorry." He said, "I know." She sat by his fire until the second bell, and then she went back to the cell, and she sat with her hand against the crescent mark, and thought about what it meant to carry a claim you had never asked for, and whether refusing it was the same as rejecting it. The third night pulled him through. She could feel it in the quality of his breathing, in the color returning to his face, in the way his hands unclenched. She applied the final dose of the protocol before the second bell and watched the fever break cleanly, the way her mother had described. A single long exhale and then the body settling into the particular stillness of someone who has stopped fighting something and can finally rest. She was gathering the used cloth from the washstand when he said, "I intend to contest Vord's reclassification." She turned. He was sitting up in the bed, his color restored, his eyes on her with the same specific weight they had carried in the great hall, but different now, stripped of the formal distance he wore in public the way he wore the old scars, as a fact about himself rather than a claim on anyone else. "I also intend to have Caldrick's registry amendment examined against the founding charter," he said. "Marit has the original Pact lore training. If the amendment was falsified, she will know it." "Vord and Caldrick are already assembling the severance rite," Sarah said. "They need you incapacitated to hold it without your intervention. You were incapacitated. They will not know yet that you are not." He looked at her. "They will move quickly," she said. "The Ash Moon conclave has 2 days remaining. The witnesses are already in the keep." "Then we have less time than they do," Bastian said. The word we settled in the room without ceremony. She did not remark on it. She picked up the ceramic pot and the herbs and moved toward the door, and he said her name. She stopped. "Sarah." She turned. He was looking at her with the expression of a man who had spent 3 years holding a controlled distance from everything warm and was recalibrating, visibly, the terms of that arrangement. "Thank you," he said. She nodded and went out. Caldrick moved the severance rite to the following morning. He did it quietly, through the keep's administrative register, under the heading of a routine bond dissolution proceeding, the kind that were common enough in tributary arrangements that no one scrutinized the scheduling. He sent the notice to the officiating elder, a robed man from the Greyvale Council, and he sent a secondary notice to Vord, and he did not send any notice to the King's Chambers at all. He had the forged registry amendment in his private archive, sealed, which he had needed for 22 years and had never expected to need again. He removed it that night and read it once, confirming that the language was clean and that the authentication marks held at a distance. What he could not know, what he had not known for the 22 years since he filed it, was that Maret had read the original founding charter before he altered it, and that she had the original language committed to memory with the specificity of a keeper woman trained in Pact lore, and that Maret had a very long memory and a very long patience, and had been waiting, in her unhurried way, for exactly this moment. What Caldrick had told Bastian, over months, in small planted increments, was that the promised bride bloodline had died out naturally, a fading of an old genetic line, no heirs identified, no mark confirmed. What he had told Vord, in private, was that the tribute girl from Dunvale was a disruption to a political arrangement that benefited them both, and that a severance rite was cleaner than a sentence. What he had not told either of them was that his reason was simpler than politics. He had falsified the registry because a promised bride queen would have the charter authority to seat herself beside the Lycan king outside any warden's influence, and that was an arrangement he had spent his entire career foreclosing, because his own position existed in the space between a king without a bound queen and the wardens who filled that space with their own influence. The morning of the severance rite, Sarah was brought from the cell by 2 of Vord's guards. She had not been told what the ceremony was called. She had been told it was a tribute review proceeding, which was the administrative language the registration used, and she had dressed in her wool tribute dress and braided her hair and walked into the keep's assembly hall at the third morning bell, looking like exactly what she was. A tribute girl from a failed cattle holding in Dunvale who had done nothing wrong and had no particular claim on the world's mercy. The assembly hall was full. All 6 high wardens were present, along with their advisors and retinues. The robed officiating elder from the Greyvale Council stood at the central dais with a scroll. Vord stood at the dais's right, composed, his merchant stillness undisturbed. Caldric stood at the dais's left, his dark eyes moving across the room with the practitioner's habit of monitoring variables. There was no throne in the assembly hall. The king's chair was absent. That was the design of the thing. A ceremony that looked administrative, held before full witnesses, at a time when the king was understood to be incapacitated. Sarah was brought to the center of the room and told to kneel. She knelt. Her knees touched the cold stone. The assembly pressed in around her, robed and armored and watching, and she felt the specific weight of witnessed exposure. The same weight she had felt in the tribute cart with the iron ring at her ankle. The same weight the headman's voice had carried in the frost-crusted yard when he used the word honor. She kept her face level. She held her hands flat on her thighs. The officiating elder began the recitation. It was written in formal pact language, the old registry dialect, and it named her by designation rather than name, a Greyvale territory tribute female, and it described the rite as a precautionary dissolution of any involuntary protobond that may have been initiated by mark identification in the absence of formal charter proceedings. 22 years since the bloodline was registered as extinct. 40 cattle that her village could not provide. 1 girl in a chain who had not been told what she was carrying. The elder was 3 lines into the recitation when the assembly hall doors opened. Bastian walked through them without announcement, the same way he had entered the great hall during the conclave, without herald or trumpet or ceremony, simply arriving, the air thickening around him and the room going quiet in a wave that started at the doors and moved inward until the only sound was the elder's voice, which faltered and stopped. He was dressed for the assembly. He walked through the silent room to the dais, and he stopped in front of Vord, and he looked at him with the pale gray eyes that held no anger, which was somehow more serious than anger. "This proceeding," Bastian said, "was not filed with my administrative seal." Vord held his ground. He had a merchant's nerve along with a merchant's stillness. "Routine tributary matter, my king. No seal required for a registration dissolution." "It required a charter basis citation," Bastian said. "Show me the registry amendment on which this dissolution rests." Caldric moved, very slightly, at the dais's left. Bastian did not look at him. He kept his eyes on Vord. Vord produced the amendment from the fold of his cloak. He held it out with a steadiness that was almost impressive. Bastian took it. He looked at it for a moment, and then he said, without raising his voice, "Marit." The old keep woman came through a side door as if she had been standing just outside it, which she had. She moved to the dais with her unhurried certainty and took the amendment from Bastian's hands and read it in the flat, examining silence of someone checking a thing against a version they already carry in their head. She turned it over. She read the authentication marks. Then she set it on the dais and said, without any particular drama, "Article 14 of the Iron Pact Founding Charter states the promised bride bloodline is identified by a crescent mark below the left collarbone." This amendment cites Article 14 as its authority for the extinction registration, but Article 14 in the original charter contains a second clause that states no mark holder may be registered extinct without a physical examination confirming absence of living lineage. No such examination is recorded. The amendment's authentication seal is dated to a period when the registry clerk was Caldric. The room held very still. Bastian looked at Caldric. "You filed a fraudulent registry amendment," he said. "22 years ago, you registered the promised bride bloodline as extinct without the required verification. You have been advising this throne on the basis of records you falsified." Caldric did not collapse into confession. He was not that kind of man. He straightened slightly and said, with the precision of someone who is prepared for this contingency, "The amendment was filed in good faith on the evidence available at the time." "The evidence was you," Bastian said. "There was no one else. You were the only record keeper who touched those documents." Caldric said nothing more. Bastian turned to Vord. "You knew the amendment was the basis for this right, and you did not verify its authority." He paused. "You also filed a reclassification notice against a tribute worker in your territory designation without grounds, for the purpose of confining her so this ceremony could proceed before I recovered." Vord took one breath. He said, "My king, the tributary system requires stability. A bride mark claim from an unregistered girl would destabilize 6 territories worth of established precedent. I acted in the interest of the pact." "You acted," Bastian said, "in the interest of your warden seat." He turned away from Vord, and Vord made the last mistake available to him. He reached for the short blade at his belt. The room did not have time to react. Bastian moved with the specific economy of a man who had been at war, and when the movement resolved, Vord was on the stone floor and still, and Bastian stood with the blade in his hand and no visible exertion on his face. The way a force of nature looks after it has done what it does. One of the wardens exhaled. The sound moved through the assembly like the first stone dropped into a still pond. Bastian set the blade on the dais. He turned, and he walked to where Sarah still knelt on the cold stone, because no one had told her to rise, and she had not presumed. He stopped in front of her. He looked down. She looked up at him, because the stubbornness was constitutionally incapable of anything else. Her knees cold, her hands flat on her thighs, her collar high, the crescent mark hidden beneath it. He held out his hand. She took it, and he drew her to her feet, and in the same motion he turned her gently to face the assembly, one hand settling on her shoulder with the particular weight of a public claim, a gesture that needed no amplification in a room that was already adjusting around the fact of what it meant. "This woman carries the promised bride mark confirmed by the founding charter of the Iron Pact," Bastian said. His voice carried to the assembly's edges without effort. The registry amendment declaring her bloodline extinct was forged. The severance proceeding called for this morning has no charter basis and is void. Caldric of this court is stripped of his counselor's seal and exiled from all pact territories effective this hour." He paused. "Her name is Sarah of Dunvale. You will use it." The silence lasted 3 more seconds. Then the first warden went to one knee. He was a big man from the Eastern Territory, weathered and hard, and the movement was not quick, but it was deliberate. The kneel of a man who has reassessed the situation and found his previous position untenable. The second warden followed, then the third, and then the retinues and advisors and guards, dropping one by one through the assembly until the hall was a field of bowed heads and bent necks. Bastian did not kneel. He turned to her instead, and she saw in his face the specific thing she had been misreading since the Great Hall. Not cruelty, not authority performing itself, but the mask of a man who had kept himself at a controlled distance from warmth for 3 years and was finally, at some cost, she could feel but not fully measure, letting the distance close. He said quietly, for her only, "I cannot undo the tribute cart. I cannot undo the 4 days in a cell. I cannot undo what Caldric erased 22 years ago." He paused. "I can spend the rest of what I have making certain none of it touches you again." She thought about telling him she had not chosen this, that she had not walked into his keep wanting to be a promised bride, that she had wanted only to go home to Dunvale and her cold fields and her uncomplicated life. All of that was true. She could feel it sitting in her chest alongside something else that had grown quietly across 3 nights in a firelit chamber and a ceramic pot, and the questions he asked, and the way he had said the word, "we." "You almost died," she said. "You prevented that." "I want that on record," she said. "Formally, in the founding registry, with Moret's attestation and a proper seal." Something moved in his expression that she had not seen before. A warmth that surfaced and stayed, not retracted, not managed. It looked startling on a face built for authority, the way light looks startling in a room that has been closed for a long time. "Done," he said. Caldric was escorted from the assembly hall by 2 guards before the wardens rose from their kneel. He went without spectacle, the way men who traffic in records and precedent tend to go when the records have been turned against them, with a careful composure that cost him considerably more than it appeared to. He did not look at Sarah as he passed. She watched him go and felt nothing that resembled satisfaction, only a cold, settling completion, like a door pulled shut against a draft that had been running through a room for 22 years. The assembly filed out. The elder rolled his void scroll and departed without ceremony. The witnesses dispersed by territory and rank, and the assembly hall emptied until it held only a few people who had earned the right to still be there. Marit stood at the hall's eastern edge with her wooden tablet under her arm and her wool mantle pulled close, watching the last of the wardens go. She did not look triumphant. She looked, as she always looked, unhurried and certain. A woman who had held a fact in her memory for 22 years and had simply waited for the correct moment to produce it, because that was what keeping was, and she had kept very well. The days that followed were quieter than Sarah had expected, after everything. There was a great deal of administrative work, the kind that follows any public exposure of fraud, and the Keep's registry had to be amended formally, and the Greyvale warden seat filled by a deputy pending a full territorial review. Bastian moved through it with the same contained efficiency he brought to everything, and he sent Moret to Sarah 3 times with questions about the exact language of the founding charter's Article 14, because he wanted the amended registry to be precise beyond any future challenge. On the 4th day, he asked Sarah to walk with him. They walked the Keep's north face, where the cold hall opened onto a narrow stone gallery overlooking the black pine forest and the frozen gorge below. The sky was the hard blue of winter mornings, and their breath fogged in front of them. He did not make a speech. He did not recite the charter language or discuss the political implications of the Bridemark bond or outline the terms of the arrangement as if she were a treaty to be negotiated. He walked beside her and asked her what she wanted. Nobody had asked her that. She thought about it seriously, which he seemed to appreciate, because he waited without filling the silence. She said she wanted to send word to Dunvale that the cattle debt was settled and would not be transferred to another girl. She said she wanted Marit to have an official title rather than a Keep woman's informal authority. She said she wanted to continue her healer's work rather than set it aside for ceremonial obligations. He said he could do all 3 things. She said, "I still have not formally consented to the bond." He said, "I know." "I am telling you that now," she said, "because I wanted to say it before the charter said it for me." He looked at her sidelong. The cold was turning his breath into smoke beside hers. "And?" She thought about the crescent mark, and her mother's hands pressing flat against it, and the word her mother had said, "Never let them see this." She thought about what it had cost to keep it hidden, and what it had meant that he had seen it anyway, and what he had done since with what he had seen, which was to wait, and to recover, and to arrive at the right door at the right moment, and to say her name before witnesses until the room bent. "And I consent," she said, "for my own reasons." The corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile. It was what a smile looked like on a face that had spent 3 years at a controlled distance from the thing it wanted. He said nothing. He offered his hand, the scarred one, with its old battle knuckles and its particular weight. She took it, and they stood on the cold stone gallery with the black pine forest below them and the sky hard and blue overhead. And the crescent mark beneath her collar had the same size and shape it had always had, but it did not feel hidden anymore. The debt to Dunvale was formally discharged within the week. 40 cattle converted to one girl, converted back to a settled account, stamped with the Lycan king's seal and sent south by courier. The village headman received it with the careful blankness of a man confronted with a reality he had not prepared for, which was appropriate. Maret received her title, Keeper of the Founding Records, with a formal chamber in the keep's packed lore archive and access to every registry document in the collection. She accepted it without particular ceremony, the same way she had accepted everything, as a fact being placed on a table, and then she went back to work. The assembly hall was set for the formal claiming ceremony 7 days after the severance rite was voided. The same wardens who had knelt in the emergency of the moment returned now to kneel formally, by charter protocol, before the Lycan king and the woman he named. The dais was cold stone and high rafters and the smell of hearth fire and old timber, and Sarah stood at its threshold in a dress that was not tribute wool for the first time since she had left Dunvale, and she felt the assembly's weight the way you feel weather before it arrives, pressing down and close and real. Bastian stood at the dais's center and extended his hand. She walked to it. The bond's confirmation was not lightning or fire or any of the mythic machinery she might have invented if she had been told this moment was coming. It was warmth, specific and located, running from his hand to hers and settling across the crescent mark with the particular sensation of something that has been waiting a long time finally coming to rest. She felt her mother's training in her hands. She felt the 4 days in the tribute cart. She felt 3 nights of firelight and wolfsbane and the word we. She did not kneel, because the charter did not require it, and Bastian had told her plainly that he would not ask her to kneel before him in this room or any room for any reason, and she believed him. He went to one knee before her, briefly, which the charter also did not require. The assembly was very quiet. She looked down at the top of his dark head, and the scarred hand holding hers, and the stone floor of the keep that had held tribute girls and wardens and a very long fraud, and she thought that the headman of Dunvale had called it an honor, and she thought that he had not been entirely wrong, only entirely ignorant of what the honor was. Bastian rose. He turned to the assembly. He did not make a speech. He said, "Sarah of Dunvale, my queen." The wardens knelt in sequence, the same wave that had moved through the room the morning after the severance rite. And this time, it felt different. Not the snap calculation of men reorienting to power, but something slower, something that acknowledged a thing as settled. When the assembly filed out and the hall thinned again, Maret was the last one standing, at the hall's eastern edge with her wooden tablet under her arm. She looked at Sarah across the empty room with the expression of someone who has been patient for a very long time and found the wait exactly worth it. She bowed. It was a small bow, the kind that contains more than ceremony. Sarah nodded to her. Outside the keep's north face gallery, the black pine forest was still, and the gorge below held the last light of winter afternoon the color of old bronze. The crescent mark rested below Sarah's collar, not hidden, not announced, simply there, the way a thing is when it has finally stopped being a secret and become just a part of what is true. Bastian's scarred hand was open at her right. Maret stood at her left. She did not go back to Dunvale. She stayed.